know that. I'm running a course on data journalism this semester, and a lot of you are actually taking part in this course. I didn't force them to be here, but they wanted to take part. And yeah, I'm glad that we will get the chance over the semester to engage with a couple of experts in understanding how data journalism works in practice, what the challenges are, how we should think about communicating findings effectively to, yeah, well, heard you speak, I would say to make the world a better place. Maybe that's too big, but I think it's not wrong either. So yeah, please use that as an opportunity, today's event and all the other events, to get engaged in that conversation. The way this is going to work is that we're going to have 1 hour for that. Our speakers take most of the time for providing us insight. And then there will hopefully also be a bit of time for questions, for an exchange. The sessions will be moderated, not by me, and I'm glad about that, but by participants of the data journalism seminar. And I'm going to hand over to Lou in a second, who's going to be the first doing that for today's session. Just one more thing. Aliyah from the Data Science Lab will take pictures to cover the event. If you're not fine with that, please approach her, and we'll make sure to not have you in the picture. All right, I think that's everything I wanted to say. Thanks again for being here. Stay tuned for future events, and I hand over to Lou to give a proper introduction to our speaker of today.
Hello, everybody, and welcome. I'm very excited to introduce to you Bronner, whose work lies on a particularly interesting intersection of data, social science, and public life, and who's focused on making online spaces healthier and less harmful. She's a scientific director at the Public Discourse Foundation, as well as a senior applied scientist at ETH Zurich, where she leads and contributes to projects on hate speech, toxicity, and online discourse. She's produced rigorous academic and public-facing work with her time as a quantitative editor at the 538, as well as her contributions to the site, always bringing clarity and evidence to complicated social and political issues. She holds a PhD from the London School of Economics with early research studies at Oxford University, and we are very lucky to have her here today. So please welcome me and giving her a warm applause.
Thanks. That was super nice. Very nice intro. Yeah, so I'm very pleased to be here to kick off this series. I will try and start. I don't need to dwell on this because Lou introduced me. So my credentials for being here is that I used to be at 538, which used to be a data journalism website, which no longer exists. It was at the time run by Nate Silver, who is a person that some people might know and some subset of those people might admire. He who was my boss at 538. It was a great time when I was there. It seems weird to be speaking about this as a sort of in memoriam kind of segment, but that is a little bit what it is. I am hopeful that the things I learned there hopefully travel and hopefully are still interesting. Although you will see that a lot of my examples are a little bit from the 2019 to 2021 period, which is when I was there. So I hope that remains relevant. Yeah, my PhD is in political science, and I have a lot of experience being disappointed by data. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about is firstly is sort of a little bit of a brief glimpse into what I did as a quant editor at 538. So what were sort of the questions that I asked of data when I was faced with it, which was often. The next bit will be sort of hopefully useful in the sense of it will hopefully go in between sort of, I have a data set, I have a question, how do these two things relate to each other, and can I do the thing that I wanted to do with the data that I have? And then the third section will be on when you want to make the data the story, which is a little bit what I specialized in, if you want to call it that, at 538. Please do ask questions while I'm going, especially. I mean, this is a little bit of a time. If your questions are what was COVID-19, then maybe I can help you with that. But there are hopefully, yeah, just let me know if there are other things you want to know. So first, how to interrogate data. So, there's no perfect data. There are three options that I found in my time. A, it's good enough. That means you write about it anyway. You hopefully note the caveats. It's not usable because it's just trash. I mean, this is actually more data than you would think, is just because of the caveats that it has. It just effectively is not usable either for the question that you have or just in general, unfortunately, because often a lot of work went into collecting it. But it is what it is. And the third option is sort of to make the issues the story, which is going to be the last thing I talk about. So what question it falls into depends on the question you're asking. Sorry, I'm sort of in the way. Okay, the research question and your data need to match. So what I think this won't help with is sort of, I have a research question, where should I go for data? I have a data set, what do I ask? Although maybe it will a little bit get into that. What I hopefully will help with is sort of, I have a question, I have a data set. Is this data adequate to answer my question? How can I make sure I'm not asking too much? I'm not claiming too much. What can and can't I say considering the data I have? And importantly, and I really want to stress this, especially in sort of a very quantitative field and a very quantitative world that we are in, is that using quantitative data responsibly requires qualitative understanding of the data generating process at a minimum, but really just why this data exists in the form that it exists. And I think that is something I learned a lot about working with actual journalists who by and large were trained in journalism to ask questions, to call people and ask about things, right? And I think that sometimes when we approach things from a data perspective, from a quantitative perspective, and we think that we have this set of skills, have this set of tools that we can just parachute in and do things, and we can do things, but we really want to make sure that we have this qualitative understanding. Okay, so before we get to that, what does it mean to interrogate data? It's really the basic questions. How was this data collected? Was it downloaded? Was it scraped? Was it collected by hand? Hopefully not. Could there have been a collection error? Even if it was scraped, I mean, the websites change, right? Could it in theory be recollected, or has something changed? Some polls sort of have this thing where as they move, they sort of change the past, like the what you had last week changes this week depending on the smoother that is used, for example. That's something that would be relevant to know, because then it matters when you collected the data. Who did it come from? Is it a public poll? Is it a government or administrative data? Is it a private company? Whoever it is, do they have a vested interest in showing a certain outcome? Is any part of it the output of a model? This is actually often not that clear, what goes into the model. So for example, voter file data, which I worked with in one of my previous jobs, is you have something like propensity to vote, right? But that's modeled based on a bunch of other stuff that goes in. And so understanding sort of what are the difficulties with all components of that is often harder than you might think. What are the criteria for inclusion? Are there rules for inclusion or exceptions? So for example, we did a bunch of stuff in 2019 on Democratic primary candidates, dating me a little bit. We wrote a whole article on this is how we're defining a major presidential candidate, because if you don't define it, there are 750 candidates, right? And so you have to say, okay, this is the person who has formally begun a campaign, is running to win, not just to draw attention, has hired at least 3 full-time staffers. I mean, this is all kind of arbitrary, right? But we had to make a list of rules so that we knew what we were talking about when we talked about a Democratic primary candidate. Are you only looking at units with a certain outcome? Could there be selection effects going on? So here are some highlights or some headlines from different completely different types of stories. But for example, we've studied every mass shooting since 1966. Here's what we've learned about the shooters. So you have this data set of shooters, but what's not in there is not shooters, right? Like people who don't commit these kinds of shootings, who maybe have a lot of the same attributes as the shooters, but you're not looking at that if you're only looking at the data set of shooters. Same thing when you look at 121 habits of successful people. Probably unsuccessful people also wake up in the morning and eat breakfast, for example, right? But that's not really going to tell you where. So this is something that is often kind of like neglected, but obviously you will have learned a lot about this in your studies here. Does it combine multiple sources? Are they matchable? So these are 3 definitions of Atlanta, for example, which I discovered when I was working with Atlanta data. The metropolitan statistical area is enormous. The urbanized area is less enormous, but also really weird and jagged. And then you have the census place, which is a whole different definition. So if you're trying to merge data and like some of like economic data is on one level, crime data is on another level, you merge it, you're not going to get anything. Sorry, city level spend percent. How is it processed? So this is like the nitty gritty of like looking at code. Like, was there recoding or changing? Is there a record of those changes? Was this done in like an Excel file that no one has any like understanding of what happened in it? Or was it done in code, right? Which is often more annoying to do, maybe, but then actually there's a record of it. Was it subset? Could that induce bias, maybe in the way that I just talked about? Was it merged with other data? Like, are units then dropped at some point, which happens more often than not. So this is all sort of the nitty gritty of interrogating data. There's also this whole question of p-hacking. How many tests were run on the data before you got to the interesting analysis that you have? Are there subgroup analyses? How many? How big are the subgroups? Were hypotheses identified in advance? This is an XKCD comic, which I'm sure you have all seen. Showing that, oh, there's a link between jelly beans and acne, but it's only a certain color that causes it. And then you do all the different tests for the different colors. And then the finding is green jelly beans are the ones linked to acne, right? There is this amazing p-hacking well, it was an interactive on 538. Now 538 doesn't exist anymore, but there is a recreation by Andrew Heiss, which is great, and I do encourage you to play around with this. It shows just how seductive it is to play around with different things and then ex post come up with an explanation for why you're doing them in order to get a relationship that might be interesting. And you can always justify to yourself why it is interesting. Okay, so another thing is sort of what's your baseline? A lot of even descriptive stuff is comparative, right? So you have a certain set of data and then you're like, okay, what am I comparing this to something to make it interesting, right? So this is from 2021 and it was the Bundestagskandidaten in the German elections. And so they had all this stuff about like, oh, this share is women and this share is from different countries. And so what's missing from this article and what I think would have been really interesting is sort of like, okay, but how does that compare to the population? How does that compare to like the existing Bundestag, for example? How does that compare to like the plausible set of candidates from which you're drawing, which maybe is not the population, right? Anyway, so like what is your comparison is an important point. Are similar but distinct concepts used to mean the same thing? So a thing if you're looking at US election stuff and you're concerned about, or you're wondering who will win certain elections, the question is sort of like everyone is fighting for independent voters. And people often assume that independent voters are also moderate and are also the ones that you're fighting for because they're maybe undecided between major candidates. But if you look at polls, actually, 32 or 33% of people call themselves moderate. Can't see how many people call themselves independent. 10-ish, 13-ish. And 11% call themselves undecided, but actually only 2.4% call themselves all three, right? So these are different concepts, and in reality, they do not apply to the same people, right? The same people do not apply them to themselves, which is, for example, interesting to know if you're just if you're thinking about US elections, right? But especially if you're actually working with. Okay, so what questions can I answer with the data that I have? All right, so it is 2020. It is March 2020. I don't want to know how old you are. Anyway, the world is shutting down. There are a lot of stats coming out, right, about like this number of cases in this place and this number of cases in this place. And everyone is obviously reporting those stats, right, because it's all you have. And it's also potentially very interesting. So the first question is like, well, why do I want to use this data? well, it's very newsworthy. It's like basically the only question that anyone had at the time. But then what are the issues with it? And we knew that there were like a lot of issues at the time, right? So there was not enough testing generally. Testing available, and importantly, it wasn't just that like all places had the same difficulties with testing, right? Testing availability and testing criteria differed across place and across time, right? So like tests became more available, less available, and the numbers would go up and go down, not because the cases would go up and down, but just because there were more or less tests available, right? And also across place, right? So we knew that like red states, for example, with Republican governors or legislatures, like didn't allow as much testing as blue states, or there just wasn't as much testing available. And so if you did like sort of state level correlations between like partisanship and number of cases, that would be confounded just by this fact, right? And then there was the whole additional thing of like, you know, sometimes people are getting tested, but that was actually not reported in the statistics, right? So what it shouldn't be used for, and this was like a live question at the time in many newsrooms, was sort of, maybe I just go on the other, no, but on the way there, okay. Was sort of like causal analysis of how like lockdowns affect tests, or you know, like Republican governors or whatever you're thinking of, right? Like all this stuff, we know it probably did affect the cases, but the case numbers that we had were just not, the data was just not good enough to be able to like draw those comparisons and have them make any sense. But what it could be used for is descriptive reporting, which is obviously important. Noting the caveats, right? So all these are like sort of examples of that. And also trying to understand the differences that we saw between numbers of cases, right? So as I said, Republican versus Democrat, for example, those numbers are interesting. They're just maybe not revealing what some people might want them to reveal, right? But if you report that reasonably, then there's nothing wrong with reporting, right? So one thing we did here was, this was in July, so it was not in March. So there were perhaps different caveats with the data at that time. But what we tried to look at here was like, well, are there differences in where the testing shortage is the worst, right? And so we, as with everything that is correlated with population, it's like very hard to draw apart these things, right? Like if you look at income, if you look at race, if you look at all these things are correlated, especially in the US, but in many places, in ways that make it very hard to like draw any kind of causal story. And that's also not what we were trying to do, right? We were like, okay, racial differences are interesting in and of themselves, right? And so we came up with a way to try and quantify that, right? By looking at census block groups and saying whether they were majority Black, majority Hispanic, or majority white. And then how many COVID testing locations there were there relative to the number of people that could potentially want to go to those testing locations. So we're trying to measure like the potential overcrowding, or we called it potential patient demand, at the testing sites in these places. A whole bunch of assumptions went into this. I wrote a separate piece, which is actually not the article, but a methodology, like outlining all these assumptions, because we made the assumptions and I wanted to be transparent about it. But I do think that in the end, these discrepancies that we found, this continues down, but essentially, and we also only looked at cities, right? Because rural areas have all different, there, maybe the issue is not potential demand, but the issue is how far you have to drive to get to a testing location, right? So we didn't look at that at all. But essentially, I think that these comparisons that we ended up with are informative. They're not a causal story of, you know, race causes certain things, or I guess the other one doesn't, like, certainly doesn't cause racial differences. But like the idea was to provide a descriptive piece that is hopefully illuminating while noting all the many caveats of this data. The other reason was that, like, you know, testing locations, we were more confident in that data relative to, for example, test cases, right? All right. Election night electoral returns. So why do I want to use this? Well, you want to know who will win the election, right, as early as possible. What are the issues with it? Well, the returns don't come in random order, right? You don't have like random places reporting who won or how many votes people get in a random order. Rather, like, you know that small areas, rural precincts report first, and so those are obviously not representative. And so you want to integrate that into your understanding. As well, in the data, like in the AP podcast and other stuff, mistakes can be made and they can be corrected on the fly, which is also weird if you're trying to visualize these kinds of data. Precincts are also wildly different sizes, so remember that because it will come up in about a minute and a half. So what it shouldn't be used for, but what it always is used for, is breathless reporting of each new vote drop, right? So like, oh, this place reports like, Dixville Notch, right? Where it's like the first one that's reported and it is Trump got whatever, 10 votes and whoever it is, got 8. So that is not what you should do. That is obviously still what people do because there's nothing else to talk about during the night. But what it could be used for is, for example, election night modeling, which my brother Lenny, who is speaking here in a few weeks, will talk about. And he is very much the expert on that, so I'm not even going to touch that. But another thing is, for example, descriptive reporting that you can also use this data for, but with context, right? So one of the things we did, for example, at 538 was we were like, okay, so how many outstanding votes do we expect in Pennsylvania as of 11:23 Eastern on November 6th? So these are the number of votes that have gone to Biden. These are the number of votes that have gone to Trump. Potentially, like these number of votes are projected to remain, right? And this is what that would have to look like in order for Trump to win, for Biden to win, right? So this is the way that you kind of responsibly use this kind of descriptive data to inform people without being like completely just like, oh, more votes here, more votes here. Another thing that you could do, which we in fact did on election night, is do something like this, right? So we tracked the number of votes that were reported at each point. So this is time overnight, and these are the number of votes reported for each of the two parties. This is in Wisconsin, and so we see that like over time, obviously more and more votes get reported, and then we see that there's this like jump here, which is when Milwaukee County came in, right? Which is like, this is why I said that precinct sizes matter, right? Because like some precincts are very tiny and then you get these like minor incremental changes, and some precincts are very large. So when the vote drops, like the vote really drops. The problem with this is that, and we thought about this in advance, right? And I was like, oh, this is an informative chart. People will learn things from this chart. What I didn't realize was that people would turn this chart into this, which is perhaps my biggest impact on the internet that I've ever had, somewhat to my embarrassment. And it's still around. This meme is still around. And then we didn't expect this, obviously. We were completely blindsided. What we then try to do is like, make the story clearer and try to say, okay, what is a red shift? What is a blue shift? Why does the vote at the beginning maybe not look like the vote at the end, right? And so here we have Georgia, which also sort of like was red looking initially, and then at the end, Biden pulled ahead. But then on the other hand, you have North Carolina, where Biden initially led, but then Trump ended up with. So we tried to then contextualize the story. But sometimes this is just to say, sometimes you really think these things through and you think you're being responsible. And I would argue we were. And yet people can still take what you do and turn it into misinformation. So something to remember. Okay, another type of data, another set of questions. How am I doing for time? Okay. Yeah, so if you think about the Supreme Court and how the ideology of the individual Supreme Court justices, maybe now it's arguably still important. Why do I want to use this? Well, it's an important question, right? These people have a lot of power. There's only 9 of them. You might want to know like what they think about certain things. And it promises some kind of quantifiable insight into this important question. It's also pretty widely used. But this has a lot of issues, right? The model that produces these scores assumes that the cases are broadly similar every year. It assumes the justices are similar every year, which they're not, right? And so what this leads to is essentially that like the positional changes that it produces are actually not that useful because they assume this continuity that just doesn't exist. So what you should be like, the way that you should probably use it more is to rank order justices and then make judgments about, well, this person we think is more right-wing than that person or whatever, rather than saying like, oh, the court now is much more right-wing than it used to be. you can just read their case reports, right? But anyway, so this is from the New York Times, and so it tracks, how people have moved over time. And I would argue that this is actually not a great way to use this kind of data, right? Because this, again, it assumes that like the cases are the same every year, which is not the case. We, at 538 also did this, right? So I'm not just like ragging on the Times. Like this is something that a lot of places did, and I don't think it's great practice. We eventually like switched to or shifted to this kind of rank ordering approach, right? Where we did try to like show, okay, in this particular case, this was when Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, and we were trying to show, okay, well, if, assuming Trump appoints someone sort of in this vicinity, like, what does that mean for the court as a whole? And then we tried to quantify how, like, you can't see the change. Sort of like what that, like this would be like the third biggest change overall in history, assuming that Trump appoints someone, which is where he ended up appointing someone. So we're, right in our prediction, and then we tried to contextualize that shift relative to other shifts in the past. Okay, back to COVID-19. So COVID-19 modeling as well. Well, why do I want to use this? Maybe I can minimize this. Yeah, okay. Well, it's important public health messaging, right? So like a lot of public health decisions and a lot of sort of political decisions in 2020 were based on these models ultimately, right? Like something about like, well, if you have a disease that is so and so infectious and so deadly, and this is what you have to do to stop it from spreading. But as we all knew, there were issues with it, right? Like it assumes uniform parameters in terms of transmissibility, sickness, no reinfections, small populations, all this stuff. So what we did at the time, so yeah, what we argued was like it shouldn't be used for predictions, at least not for us, right? Obviously, some people have to do the predictions because it's their job. We, as a 35-person data journalism website with no epidemiologist on staff, that was not our job, and I was like very adamant that that is not what we should be doing. What it can be used for, though, is simulating scenarios, right, with caveats. And so what we did is this sort of herd immunity simulator, where you sort of set how contagious a disease is and how deadly it is and how long a person is immune for, and then you can sort of like watch it go and see how that affects this fictional population that you have. Ours was, obviously amazing, but this is really the one that you should be looking at, which is by Harry Stevens. It was then at the Washington Post. And this went like completely viral. I think it was the most read story that the Washington Post had ever had, probably still has. So this sort of shows how these things, how the number of recovered, healthy, and sick change over time. If you have like no limits on population movement, and then that's not what I wanted. And then if you have limits on population movement, right? So in this scenario, I think 7 out of 8 people stay home and don't move, and you have only 1 out of 8 people moving around. And so you can see sort of relative to the previous one, how the infection rate changes and how the number of recovered, healthy, and sick changes as a function of that. So that was super nice. And he called it fictionitis. He was like very much showing that this was like a model, right? So I think this was a very nice and very responsible use of data journalism. Okay. I'll pause here and ask if there are any questions so far. Otherwise, I will continue. One of the things I wanted to do in particular during my time there was to see if I could make the data the story, because I think that data often is very interesting in and of itself, and turning it into a story is sometimes, it is sometimes actually quite illuminating for people who care about this stuff, right? So for example, if the data looks weird or if there are outliers, can we quantify how weird it is, right? So this was in 2019. These are, again, the US Democratic primary, where at the time, Joe Biden was the front runner, but like there were occasional polls where other candidates also were doing very well, right? So there was one poll where Biden was up by 15 points, another poll where Elizabeth Warren was up by 7 points. And so the question was sort of like, is there anti-herding? Like what is happening here? Why are they so different? And so basically what I tried to do was like, I tried to show, okay, here are here are some polls over time, and these are the polling averages for these two candidates. And here are these two individual polls that we saw, right, which are the outliers. And then tried to look at, okay, like, is the spread of polls actually bigger than we would expect by random chance, or is it not? And so what we found is that actually, if you adjust for house effects, it's not that strange, right? The discrepancies actually can be explained essentially by random chance and by house effects. So it's a bit niche, right? But like for the audience of 538, it was it was an interesting article. If the data is bad, is that an interesting story in and of itself, right? So to go back to COVID data, to go back to the modeling, right? You had some models where 200,000 Americans are going to die, and some models where 2.2 million Americans are going to die, right? And so like that is kind of sometimes terrifying, right? And so what we wanted to know was sort of why that is, and can we do a service journalism piece where we kind of explain and we dig into like what goes into a model and why do we end up at such a weird different number of deaths. And why, yeah, we did not want to have a model of our own, despite getting many emails asking us to do one. So this is essentially what we did, right? Where we cataloged sort of all the independent variables that go into these models, right? And so we then had a piece where we really went through them one by one, and we were like, okay, so this is what the uncertainty that this was in March 2020. Right. So there was a lot of uncertainty with regard to vaccines. There was a lot of uncertainty with regard to basically all of these things, right? It would maybe be interesting to go back and like see like what do we actually know stuff about now and what do we still not know? But like, what is the data being collected? How many people are actually being tested, to go back to that earlier thing? What is the kind of hospital setup that, there was this whole thing about hospital beds and are there going to be enough hospital beds? And that's why we have to flatten the curve, because then we can make sure that there isn't too much demand for hospital beds. So all of those go into like hospital capacity, and all of this ultimately goes into the fatality rate, which is just one of the things that goes into the total known deaths from COVID-19. So this was our attempt to like pull back the curtain a little bit on these models and try to explain what was going on. It also got turned into a comic by Zach Smith, which is really cool. And then the other question is like, why is the data bad, and is that an interesting story, right? I guess that's a little bit the COVID model as well. But this is a story about how basically, differential non-response, right? And how you can end up with certain news events changing who responds to polls, which then changes sort of the polling levels you have. So this was, Trump approval, disapproval after Christine Blasey Ford's Senate testimony. And this shows basically that among Trump supporters, completion rate like went up during this period, whereas among Trump disapprovers, it did not, right? So you end up sort of, so again, this is a bit niche. Again, 538 was a bit of a niche website often, but this is kind of pulling back the curtain and showing you, okay, how does this data, what is going into producing this data, and how might that affect how you read these kind of data stories? Does the process that produced the data, like, is that biased? So this was me writing a piece about an academic article written by Will Lowe, who obviously you all know, and some other people. But essentially the idea here is that like what I wanted to do was like take this like quite technical article about collider bias and turn it into something that, people who didn't know what collider bias was would understand, right? And so the idea here is that like you have different scenarios and you try to explain how what ends up in the data you collect can be biased, and that even if it looks sort of unbiased, that can hide biases that go into the data generating process, right? So I really like this. I mean, in part, it's just me taking credit for Will and Jonathan and Dean's work, but which is always nice. And also Jasmine, who actually made this chart. But on the other hand, I do think it brought this problem and this example and to a lot of people who would otherwise not have known about it, or at least have thought about it in this way. So I was pretty happy about that. And I still get people telling me that they use this in teaching. So All right, this is a case study which we can skip, or should we do it? I think we do it. Great. Okay, so here, rather than being like, here is a problem, what can you do with it? This starts with this starts with us sending Freedom of Information Act requests to 50 cities because we were trying to find out basically more about police misconduct. So the aim was to find out how much money do the cities spend on this, which cities are better or worse than others, and which cities are improving or getting worse. So spoiler here, the data did not let us answer all of these questions. And so I want to kind of walk you through a little bit why not and what we did instead. Okay, so I apparently didn't put the transition on these slides. Okay, so firstly, how much money do cities spend? Well, it's unclear. So we sent the request to 50 cities. I think something like 32 responded to us. So it was actually a reasonable response rate. But when they gave us data, we didn't know if the data that we were given was complete. And some, in fact, did tell us that like relevant incidents might be missing from the data. They also obviously gave it to us in like, PDF format or whatever. Like it was terrible. I mean, the data, just the data wrangling was like a big part of this project. But essentially, we just weren't sure that like we were capturing the full universe of money that was being spent on misconduct settlements. Secondly, like, or for a question of which cities are better or worse, it was kind of unclear, like, firstly, because the data just wasn't standardized or comparable. They didn't have the same kinds of categories. They didn't include the same things under police misconduct. What does police misconduct mean? Many cities didn't provide any definitions. Where we did have definitions, they weren't comparable. And then for the question on which cities are improving or getting worse, it's also unclear because it's kind of unclear what it means when a city spends more on police misconduct. It could be that there are more misconduct, incidents, right? And police are doing more misconduct. And so that's why they end up having to spend more money on paying off people that they've hurt, right? Or their families. Or it could be that like people who are getting hurt are learning that they can actually sue the city and get some money. And so, or maybe there's more lawyers who are actually helping them and taking those cases. So maybe it's a good thing in some sense, because even if you have two cities that have the same amount of misconduct, maybe a city which spends more on the settlements is trying to do more to make up for it in some sense, right? So like that's unclear as well. So for the first example, right, you have these two cities, you have Charleston and Cincinnati, and this is a case where they actually both have a category called civil rights. So you might think that they're comparable. So these are just stacked bars, right? So we're just comparing the share here. So both have the civil rights category, but when you look at what's not like the other categories, you see that for Cincinnati, maybe civil rights actually includes most of the things you would consider civil rights, but Charleston separately has brutality, cruel and unusual, due process, failure to render care, false arrest, et cetera, right? So you have things that maybe you would include in civil rights issues. And maybe, in fact, Cincinnati did include them in their civil rights definition, but Charleston didn't, right? So even just including these two categories is not going to tell you, comparing these two categories is not going to tell you that much. But yeah, and this is what I was talking about. Even if we had all the settlements, and even if we had a standardized definition of what each category meant, it's unclear what more payouts mean, right? Is there more misconduct? Is there better record keeping? Are there body cameras suddenly, right? And so you can actually like take that to court and get money if you were harmed. Are there more lawyers? Are there more complaints? Or is it, so all of this, this is this is the Cleveland Police Department. And then you obviously also have, like single huge payouts that like throw off the whole trend, right? Which is just how this data works, right? Where you have Tamir Rice's family getting essentially $6 million, which is a huge component of how much Cleveland paid in police misconduct settlements over this period. So anyway, what did we do? Well, we wrote up everything we had. We tried to make the qualitative aspects that I talked about at the beginning part of the story, right? So we had the quantitative, but we also tried to show the qualitative, right? And so we had this table where we did some comparing, right? We just took the raw numbers that people gave us because that's all we had. And we sort of compared, like we had like how many years did people give us and what was the total number and what was the yearly average. But then we also sort of tried to explain why this is not the whole story, right? And why this table doesn't mean, well, New York is the worst and Boston is the best. And that's, that's it. Case closed, right? And so what we ended up doing was we ended up putting everything on GitHub. We put all the data on GitHub. We didn't make it a large data set that people could download and do like straightforward comparisons because we don't want people to do that because the data wasn't comparable, right? So we put it each separately. Maybe it slowed people down a little bit. And we sort of had these like pretty detailed readmes for every city where we tried to explain, okay, after we reached out for follow-up reporting, the city sent us 7 more cases, of which 6 were related to police misconduct. All this like, boring maybe, but like important detail that we found out and that is now here and someone else can do it. And this is actually a story that I still get emails about. And people are like, well, what do I do with this data? I'm like, if I knew I would have done it. So yeah, that's what I got.
Thank you so much for this insightful talk. I'm gonna open the floor right away to the audience. Here's questions. Don't be shy. Yeah.
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much. My question concerns the fact that, I mean, you were employed there, right? So, in my case, for example, for my job, I was recently tasked with analyzing data from public procurement in Germany. And to be honest, this data is also complete bullshit. And still, in the end, I did the analysis that was requested from me. And when I tried to write in some more disclaimers than what was originally wanted, they said, oh, just throw it out, nobody understands that. What would you do in this case, or did you have a similar case as well?
Oh, yes, of course. I mean, these are the ones I'm proud of, right? Like, these are the ones that I'm like, they went well, and I want to still think about it, 5 years later. There were many cases where I was like, this language is too causal for me. And people are like, yeah, it's fine. Or, where I was like, this data is too bad. And it's like, well, but it's still interesting, right? And so this thing of like, well, sometimes you have a very interesting question, but the data is bad. And so you want to do something with the data you have, and it's not ideal. And then, yeah, obviously sometimes people don't heed your warnings, and they throw out your caveats, and I don't know what you argue, and then ultimately it's their choice, right? I think if you're putting something out with your byline, you can say, I just don't want to publish this. I don't want my name on this. Like, this is misleading, and I don't want to stand by it. But it's unclear in your specific, like, that I guess would have been an option for you. But at the same time, you did your due diligence by noting these caveats, and if then other people throw them out, you can't go home with them and be like, no, but before you use this, regurgitate my caveats, please. Like, that's, yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad.
It's on watching very German general topic.
Yeah.
I feel like it's very difficult to bridge the gap between like being very scientific size and being more general in terms of language and everything. And also like if we have any further maybe you have some findings on the user side, so like what people feedback while you're working at 538 and what a success metric is basically.
Yeah. So audience characteristics, I don't know in general. I know that at 538, our audience was like very white, very male, and very educated, basically. That was also just a product of like Nate and who he, who liked him. you know, I mean, the 538 at the time was basically the inside of Nate's brain, right? So it had like it was before the poker era. So it was like there was a lot of sports and there was a lot of politics and there was not that much else, right? And that skews a certain way. I don't know about data journalism in general. I think that like once you include other topics as well, you end up with a much broader audience. And I think that my understanding is that here a lot of different people read like besides data journalism, for example, and I don't think it's as niche as 538 was. I do think, I mean, this question of like broad versus narrow audience, that's something that was really important at 538 because, you know, if we produced a lot of articles and the, you know, median article was read by, I don't know how many people, but very few, right? Or relatively few. And then you had like the election model, right? The forecast, and that was read by basically everyone in the world. And so the kinds of, we were used to writing things a certain way for our day-to-day stories, and the shift to like, okay, but sometimes we actually have to write things so that a broader audience is interested and understands this the way we intend it was quite important. And I think that I wasn't at the site in 2016, but there was a lot of feedback that we got after 2016 that like the way that the site showed the sort of Trump versus Clinton race was misleading. And in particular, showing sort of vote probability, like the difference between sort of like expected vote share and win probability, that was not made clear enough. And so people took the wrong thing away from it. And there was a lot of effort gone, like that went into the redesign for 2020, right? And to be like, okay, like, how do we show simulations? How do we communicate to people, like, what are simulations, right? And like, we have many, many worlds, and in some worlds this happens, but in more of the worlds this happens, right? And that is like what we're trying to say. There is research, Simon does some of it on how people understand these kinds of things. So yeah, I think that's obviously relevant, and I think that was not at the beginning factored in that much to the pioneers of data journalism. And I think like over time that has become much more like factored into like how are you actually communicating these things. Yeah.
So what were the which strategies like what did they work on in the earlier stages of their career?
Yeah.
And what would just to kind of think of ideas on what to write on, like the early part of our course here. I was curious how you would advise people to spend life in the
I mean, most of the people I worked with weren't like, you know, educated to be data journalists. They went to journalism school or they studied English or something. And they also kind of liked spreadsheets on the side. And then at some point that like they were like, oh, I can track these things that I'm reporting on in the spreadsheet. And then I was like, oh, there's numbers in the spreadsheet. Like, and then, you know, it's like, oh, I can turn this into a chart. But like, actually, most of the people there didn't have like a background that was that statistically, you know, complicated, sophisticated. I mean, I don't want to say sophisticated because that's like kind of judgmental, but it was just like, and you know, a lot of what we did was like comparing means, right? Or comparing distributions or something like that, right? Which is like pretty basic in terms of like your statistical skill set, but still very, very interesting. So I think that like, what I would say is that probably what is helpful is to have people that have a solid foundation in whatever you want them to cover, whether that's politics, that they understand politics, because I think that understanding where the data comes from and what its issues are is quite important. And then you probably do, depending on the scale of the thing you're trying to set up, like maybe you want to have specialists who are specialists on certain types of modeling or certain types of, you know, you need engineers to actually have these interactives up and running and not breaking, and that you can use them on your phone and I don't know what, right? Like, but I think like on the journalism side, just like understanding the subject matters is quite crucial. Probably more so than knowing how to fit a really complicated model, which you're then just going to struggle to explain to the readers, right? I mean, that a lot of what we did was you had a difference in means or something, and then I would like in the back end, like, you know, try to run more complicated models so that we were more sure in the simple models that we then ended up showing people, right? Because it's like, well, if you have a complicated model and you're trying to show that output, you have to explain what the model did, right? And that's going to be a really long footnote that no one's going to read anyway. And so it's easier to just have a simple model and then do the robustness checks yourself, and no one ever sees them, but yeah, you're more confident.
Most of the time I feel like gathering data and making sense of the data and like all the process that is that sometimes was a really tiring process.
Yeah.
This could be like a journalistic piece in its own right. Like I feel sometimes incentivized to just write about the process because it's so interesting to see like in which cities did you get answers and so on. Do you think that actually that makes good journalism or is it
I mean, I think so. I obviously think so. And I think that like, I think, yeah, what I tried to show was some ways that you can try and do that a little bit. I generally think that it is hard to get people to care that much about like, oh, and then I emailed them again and they still didn't respond. And then I emailed them again and then I called them and then they sent me a PDF, but it was really not machine readable. Like you have to like that. Yes, but I think you have to work harder to make people care about like because otherwise it's just like yes, your job has boring bits, so does mine. But sorry, but so I think yeah, you have to work a little bit harder to make it part of the story, but I very much do think that it can be part of the story.
Great, maybe we do have time for another one or two questions.
In the context of finding more to procure data from without like with like no censorship and more.
I don't know. I mean, maybe I don't really do US data journalism anymore. So I don't know. But yeah, I could imagine that's the case.
I guess
Sorry?
how we find yeah.
I mean, generally I would like email people in positions that you're interested in. I think that like that is coming from academia and like my PhD was in like historical British stuff where I did not have the option of emailing people because they were dead. I was kind of shocked when people were like, yeah, you can just email them. And like sometimes, someone will respond. And especially when it's like data nerds, they do not have a ton of demands on their email, right? Generally, and they're extremely happy to chat to you about the problems that they have with the data. Obviously if you email politicians you're not gonna usually get them, but like the data, the people in the background with the data, like they're usually gonna be very happy to talk to you. So they're like, finally someone cares. So it'll be great.
So in terms of using AI models or classification models like perspective ABA, always not use its opposite set. It provides more like a feed within a particular embedding space, right? So as you already showcased in your presentation that considering the model assumes this. So is this one of the ways we can like clarify more confidently whenever we are relying on AI models to classify some context, like hate speech or something?
I mean, I think this kind of stuff is hard because in general, the audience of the piece you're writing is maybe not going to be super familiar with the specifics of the model you're using, right? I think what you would do, I guess, in academia is you would use like 4 different models and you'll be like, well, my results hold regardless of what I'm using, right? And so like that you don't have to care about the model. I think in journalism, you generally don't have the time to run everything 4 different ways. I guess so my time was kind of before the AI modeling era, everything. So I don't have like a sort of a set of things that I would do in that case. I mean, obviously perspective was around. I think the more widely used a model is, that gives you some amount of leverage in using it, even if it's not the best model. But I'm not sure that like I have a sort of stock answer for like this is how you do it. In general, like communicating the uncertainty in a model is always going to be helpful. If the uncertainty is so large that it means that you're not actually confident in your results, maybe that should give you pause when you write it up, right? Because while I do think communicating uncertainty, I guess I should have included that as well, is important. I also think that a lot of, I don't know, maybe you have things to say about this, like readers don't really, even if you have error bars and stuff, readers don't assimilate that. They're not like, oh, these error bars overlap, and so I shouldn't care about the comparison of means or something like that. Like the uncertainty is there, but I think people generally just go for the main point. So I think models are difficult for that reason, right? On the one hand, they do have the uncertainty, which is nice. On the other hand, it's unclear to me that showing that absolves you, right? If people are still going to take certain conclusions. I don't know, maybe there's actually research showing.
Great. Maybe so.
Can I have
Of-
one more question? You were like we have the question on the audience of 538, and like you were there maybe targeting an audience it's indirectly because they were looking for you that is more like data literate than the average, but still you put a lot of effort into like communicating it well. And my question is on those processes. So did you do internal testing? Like you had a team of like running backgrounds? Like how did you converge to like a mode of communication that well turned out to be successful, but it's also difficult?
Did it though? Doesn't exist anymore. Not in any like reasonable way. Like it was just basically different people with different backgrounds, and a lot of us read everything, and then someone would be like, I don't understand this, it's too much jargon, and then they would rewrite it, and then I would read it and I'd be like, but now it's wrong. And so I would rewrite it, and then they would read it again and be like, no, it's jargon again. And so that was our process. I mean, it was
like you had iterating, like you had people.
yeah, definitely. And I mean, it was a very like we worked in Google Docs, but it was a lot of suggestion mode and like changing certain things and being like, okay, are you now happy with it? Is everyone happy with it? And basically, it was like you had the person writing it who had to be happy with it. You had the editor who had to be happy with it. If I was not the person writing it, and it was a data heavy piece, then I would also read it and have to be happy with it. And then there were copy editors as well who had to be happy with it. And they weren't just like, oh, is the grammar good? But they would also check everything against all the data that was in it and needed sources for everything. They were like fact checkers as well. So you had like quite a lot of people that had to be happy with it, which was, I mean, so this gets back to like this question of like, performance metrics, right? And like, I mean, talking about like a dead site is a little bit ironic in that sense, right? Because it's like, well, I don't know, if it had done better, maybe it would still be alive. But we were really lucky in that we didn't really look at performance metrics. Like we were not chasing clicks. Sometimes things did really well, like that herd immunity interactive. Like we accidentally like figured out SEO and it got like a ton of clicks. That was great. No one really cared. It's not like we got more money or any kind of. People were just like, oh, you got a ton of clicks, and we're like, great. But at the same time, when things didn't do well, that was also not a problem, right? And it was a lot of freedom, and probably more freedom than a lot of people in journalism have. Whether that was a good idea, given that the site doesn't exist anymore, I don't know. At the same time, I don't know that was the reason the site doesn't exist anymore, right? Like, yeah. So I don't want to say, therefore, people should monitor their clicks all the time. That is not the conclusion I want to end on.
Well, maybe maybe there's something a bit more encouraging, piece of advice or a habit that you want to give us students aspiring to be data journalists or working with data.
Yeah, I mean, I think like there's so many aspects of the world that data like fundamentally helps us understand better, right? And so I think to me, data journalism is also like one of the reasons why people get subscriptions to places, right? It's like one of the things that converts people to subscribers at like much higher rates than other types of journalism. It's also one of the things that, to be honest, is like kind of harder to like Substackify, right? Like to do by yourself, because like this kind of work takes a team to do well. And I think that is, in some sense, it makes it hard, right? But in another sense, I think it makes it quite encouraging about like learning about the world and having people that care deeply about issues and try to translate them into findings that then a lot of other people seem to care about. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know if that's a good thing.
That's a good ending. Thank
Great.
you so much for having us. Or really happy.